All right, hello everyone, and thank you for attending this workshop. My name is Dr. Karan Spurs-Bethia. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a full-time social work educator. And so this workshop really grew out of the results that I received from my doctoral project and the current socio-political climate and the things going on around there, as well as some of the experiences that I've had with clients and some feedback that I've received from students, having discussed things around self-reflection and really feeling like it's not focused on enough. There's not enough emphasis on it in the classroom. And so today I'll have a few activities that I'll throw out there to you all, some questions that are interwoven throughout the workshop, and hopefully these are things that you can take with you and potentially incorporate into what you're doing. So yeah, let's get started. Let's get jumping right into it. So by the end of this presentation, I hope that you are able to understand the importance of self-reflection, especially when working with LGBTQIA plus clients and individuals, being able to develop these actionable plans and actionable things that can be done to integrate self-reflection into the curricula. And this is why I wanted to incorporate some of these reflection activities, some of these these activities and questions that I do ask my students when I'm working with students at this point, being able to recognize any challenges that are faced by LGBTQIA plus individuals, and what role do we play as social workers in addressing those challenges, and then being able to think about the ethical considerations and responsibilities that we have as social workers in providing care that is non-discriminatory and affirming to our clients. And so I would like to start off with a reflection activity. And so this is something that I will do with my students in the first week of the class. And I will do this honestly, with every class I'm teaching. Doesn't matter if it's a diversity class, a trauma class. This is something that I will try to do with each class that I teach, to just start off with a good way of thinking about reflection and reflecting on material, reflecting on the work that we're doing, all of that. And so let's just start into it. This is usually about 5 minutes. So if you want to pause between each of the questions, that would be great. And you can see what that is for you. So first, I would like you to write down 5 words or phrases that that describe your identity. So these could be aspects such as race, gender, class, sexuality, religion, values, life experiences, roles you've held or hold. And then take a moment to reflect on this question next. Which of these identities impact how I see and engage with clients the most? And then reflect on what biases, privileges, or even limitations might I need to be more aware of. And then lastly, in one sentence, can you complete this statement? To grow as a social worker or an educator, I will commit to. And so for me, the purpose of this activity is to encourage our students to have that quick reflection, thinking about how their personal identities influence their practice. And I usually leave that last question open-ended with no additional explanation until after the debrief, because I want to see what they're thinking about. And I like to do this in the first week because it also gives me an idea of what are things that I can input into the curriculum to help either build some of this self-reflection or build on the reflection that's already there, and understanding what my students are wanting to do. And so this is so important because I will also remind my students that self-care and self-awareness is going to be a lifelong process. No matter what we're doing, we have to use these skills around self-care and self-awareness. And it's so essential to the work that we do so that we can be ethical and culturally responsive with our clients as well as with ourselves, right? Even in our personal lives. And I'll also do this with social workers that I provide supervision with, usually in our first or second meeting. Again, to see what they do and how they use this in their practice. Because as we know, we want to try and reduce some of these incidences of burnout in some capacity. So why is self-reflection so important? And why does it matter? So it's so essential for us to recognize our own values, our own biases, our own beliefs. And as we know, this can help social workers or help us approach clients with greater cultural humility, as well as avoiding or reducing the incidences of imposing our own personal views on a client. It also enhances the ways in which we can make ethical decisions because it ensures that our interactions align with the core values of social work, things like dignity and worth of the individual, self-determination, things like that. And it helps to build that culture of humility around learning is lifelong. And we're going to have to continue to do things. We don't know what we don't know. And so we may think that we know a lot about this stuff. We might, but there's still something to be learned. And that's where that reflection will come into play. And so self-reflection also fosters this emotional resilience and helps us to navigate different cases, especially those complex cases that may come up. And as I said before, hopefully reducing the potential for burnout as well as secondary trauma, and improving our ability to engage with diverse populations effectively, and understanding that I'm not the expert. The client is the expert, and they're going to let us know what works and what doesn't work. And so another activity that I will bring up is something like this. And to go back to that first activity, that can be done in any way. You can mold it and shape it in a way that works for you. So I will put that in literally any class that I'm teaching the first week to talk about what works, what do we need to be paying attention to, why is self-reflection so important? And it helps to shape the way that we go moving forward in the class. And so for this activity, you can pause here, but we can also use this with our students. But yeah, so for the purposes of this workshop, you can pause here and jot down one bias or assumption you've had to unlearn in your own journey. And hold on to that example as we go through the rest of the workshop today. And we'll talk about some strategies and things like that. Because this can be helpful for ourselves, but also helpful for the students that we are working with. So when I think about self-reflection, we have to ask that question of what is reflection actually, and what does it actually mean? So self-reflection stems from the concepts of the social scientist Donald Stern, where he discussed reflection in practice or in action versus reflection on practice or on action. And so reflection in action refers to how individuals reflect on their actions and experiences in real time while they're still in that moment. And that may not always be something that can be done, but it's a skill that we can help our clients, or excuse me, our clients and our students sort of think about and pay attention to and build that skill up, as opposed to reflection on action or reflection on practice, which is after the fact. And so there's no right or wrong way of looking at reflection on action versus on practice. Honestly, I do both. And it has made life a little bit easier for me. Thinking about, okay, in this moment, what's going on? There's a shift in the client's demeanor, in the way they're looking at me, the way they're talking to me, their body language. So I will sit and say, what just happened? What do I need to be paying attention to? And reflect on what was going on in that moment. But then at the end of the day, most nights, I will look at and think about, okay, what does it mean? What happened? What happened today? What went well? What didn't go well? What are things I need to remember to talk to my clients about, or that I need to remember that encompassed this session, that will be important for me to think about moving forward. And so, like I said, there's no right or wrong way to reflect. And there's no ideal way of going about it. But when we utilize these reflections, it helps us to be able to get a better understanding of the client and their needs, and examining how the client responds to them as well. And we can also practice those critical thinking skills in these moments. So some of the challenges that come up, and some of the things we have to think about when it comes to self-reflection. Sometimes there's an emotional discomfort when faced with personal biases. So I've had moments where I've worked with students, I've worked with supervisees, for myself, sometimes we don't want to acknowledge a bias because we don't want to think that we can think in that way. We don't want to admit that we can think in that way or have biases, because we're here to help people. But that becomes a challenge with self-reflection, because if we're not thinking about and recognizing those biases, we might be perpetuating things that might not be helpful for or towards our clients. There's also some thoughts around time constraints in especially in academia. but also in some of those professional settings. So I don't have the time to sit and reflect on these things. I'm go, go, go. Things have to get done. And so that can be a challenge, especially in sectors of social work where, yes, our productivity and, for lack of a better word, our worth is tied so heavily to how much work we are getting done and what we're doing. And that can sometimes break down some of our ability and willingness to reflect on things. Or if we're feeling burnt out already, we may not even want to reflect on anything at that point. And one of the other things the one that I really want to highlight and emphasize, the need for guidance and structured reflection. So something that came out of the interviews for my doctoral project was that the reason behind not having enough emphasis on self-reflection is because there's no guidance. There's no structured way for us to measure what reflection looks like. And so that becomes a challenge for some people. We we may not even know what it means to reflect for ourselves, teaching our students, teaching our clients, whatever that looks like. And so there is this need for some sort of structure. And I will say there are some things out there that have been really helpful in what I do. Like recently I read a book, or I shouldn't say recently, as I was doing my doctoral project, I read a book it's called The Reflective Social Worker by Siobhan McLean. And so that was super helpful because she really did go into, these are some ways that we can use self-reflection in practice. These are some ways that we can put this out there to our students, for ourselves, for clients, to be able to reflect on these things that we're doing. The problem is, it's not widely known that these are things out there. And so that's where that challenge comes up of, we need to be able to know what these things are and what these things. And so we want to think about some things that come up in the foundations around self-reflection. So self-reflection isn't just a personal exercise. It really helps us ground ourselves into the different theories, social work theory, that may come up. So things around like critical reflection, it helps us challenge our assumptions and examine where our own biases come from. We may even look at, in particular, to what I'm talking about with LGBTQI plus individuals, queer theory. This can push us to think about how heteronormativity influences our practice and how we can disrupt some of those patterns. And then also anti-oppressive practice. So this reminds us that reflection is a tool of potentially resisting oppression, resisting systemic oppression, changing systemic oppression, and not just checking our own blind spots. And so by connecting these theories to our classroom activities, things like journaling, role plays, and I'll talk a lot more about that in a few slides, it makes reflection more than just some abstract thing. And this sort of goes back to that challenge that I was talking about of having something structured. This is also one thing that comes up in terms of the challenges. Reflection can be abstract. Self-reflection can be something that people don't grasp because there's again, there's not something that they can gravitate towards or hold on to. And so by doing these things and connecting this reflection to theory, but also to activities, it can help, it becomes something we can intentionally apply in our daily work with our clients, but also with ourselves. And so we know there's some things in the code of ethics that tells us about self-reflection, and specifically, again, for self-reflection with LGBTQIA plus clients. And so, as we know, the code of ethics is central to our profession, and it directly connects to the practice of self-reflection. And so the code reminds us that we must uphold the dignity and worth, advance social justice, maintain any sort of competence and humility. And that ethical standard 1.05 calls us to understand culture and demonstrate that cultural humility with our clients. And so for LGBTQIA plus clients, this means we have a ethical obligation to reflect on our own biases, reflect on our own values that may impact the ways that we're working with this particular individual, and address any of those barriers that may hinder that affirming care. And so self-reflection helps us to recognize when we may intentionally or unintentionally, reinforce stigma and discrimination within that space. And this is in any space that a social worker may be in. The Code of Ethics also emphasize the ethical obligation of advocacy. And so social workers must not only provide non-discriminatory, affirming services, but also challenge the structures, the policies, the laws that may be putting harm on LGBTQIA plus individuals. And so self-reflection, is not just a personal practice. It is our ethical responsibility that is rooted in the values of our profession. And so what are some of the things that come up? So as we know, as I said in the beginning, this is based on some of the socio-political climate issues that are coming up. And so we know that it's changing rapidly and continues to change with new laws, new policies, executive orders, all that stuff that's coming up that are impacting the most vulnerable populations that we work with. And so although this presentation does focus on LGBTQI plus individuals, this can be applied to any diverse and vulnerable population that we may see. And as we see, there are these increasing resistances to diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, anti-oppression, anti-racism, throughout the spaces that we may be in, social services, research, education, which is making it a little bit harder to create affirming spaces. And maybe I shouldn't say a little bit harder. It might be making it a lot harder for people to be able to create safe and affirming spaces, or calming and affirming spaces for the clients that we are working with. And so some of the challenges that our LGBTQI plus individuals and clients may experience may be struggles to access competent, affirming healthcare and mental health care because of that systemic discrimination and stigma that is faced. And there are also some significant disparities in things like employment, housing, legal rights that may contribute to both economic and social instability that someone is experiencing. And so due to these compounded stressors, LGBTQIA plus individuals may experience increased risks of trauma, substance use, mental health concerns, anxiety, depression, all of those things. Think about the minority stress theory. That's something that is likely going to be happening. And if we don't have social workers that are able to provide that level of care, that affirming care that is needed, this will continue to build that cycle. So this is why self-reflection is so, so important, to really understand what that looks like. And I put this picture on the screen or on the slide because I liked the representation that it had. So stigma really weighs people down. Sometimes the ball may be smaller, sometimes the ball is a lot bigger. But it does feel like the shackle that someone has on them, and they may not be able to move. They may feel stuck. They may feel anchored in that space. They may feel like they're drowning. And so this is what comes up when I think about some of the challenges that LGBTQI plus individuals may experience and how stigma and discrimination contributes to that. And so we also want to talk about intersectionality. So when we think about LGBTQIA plus clients, we can't look at gender identity and sexual orientation, gender expression in isolation. So many clients face racism, ableism, classism, religious stigma, any of those types of things. And this intersectionality often compounds marginalization and influences how clients experience discrimination as well as accessing services that they need. And so as social workers, self-reflection helps us to become aware of our own perceptions. Again, what privileges do we hold? What biases do we hold? And how those intersecting identities might shape the client's journey. So for example, a Black transgender woman or a woman who is transgender and Black may face both transphobia and racism in a healthcare setting, which then requires us to reflect on how we provide that affirming care. And if they're experiencing transphobia and racism in that healthcare setting, what's going on? What do we need to do? How can we help a little bit more and a little bit better? And again, that's where that reflection will come into play. And so a couple of statistics that have come up in the past year or so, couple of years. You may have heard or seen the latest Gallup poll that came out. I believe that was in January of this year, that it stated the population, 9.3% of the U.S. population identifies as LGBTQIA+. Now, if I remember correctly, that is up by about 3% from the previous poll that they did. We also look at things around like LGBTQIA plus youth. And so these two bullets here, youth living in states that have fewer policies that protect rights have higher rates of suicidal behaviors. We're seeing that, as well as having poor mental health due to some of these policies. And that's a huge number. So that 90%, that's a huge number. And thinking about this last one, about 44% of LGBTQI plus adults report higher levels of depression, anxiety, substance use than their heterosexual counterparts. And this may be a little bit higher as well. And I'm not entirely sure, but we have to think about that too and pay attention to how do we get this data and what comes up around that. And I bring these statistics up to illustrate the point that we're going to be working with someone who is LGBTQI plus, and that there are high rates of mental health that goes untreated because of the stigma, the discrimination, lack of awareness and knowledge of how to work with an LGBTQIA plus individual, or even the unwillingness to be able to work with someone. And so that is something we will want to and need to reflect on and pay attention to. And so, in addition to some of the activities, I have a case study or a case example that I wanted to throw out there. And this is an example that I might provide to students when thinking about this as well. And then we would have a conversation in breakout rooms, or when I was in person, it was breaking them out into different groups and having a discussion, and then coming back together to have a group discussion. Excuse me, as a group to discuss. And so during those group discussions, in addition to having the conversation around what they would do, so, and you'll see that question up there, I would throw out some other reflection questions that they may ask themselves. Something like, what was the mistake that happened? Or how might this affect the client's trust in you and their sense of safety? And what steps can you take to repair the harm, or prevent this from happening again? And so what's nice is that many of these questions and examples can be tailored to whatever population you might be working with at this time. So, looking at this case example, imagine you have a student or a client who is misgendered repeatedly in a classroom or clinical setting. Although the misgendering may not be intentional, it creates harm by making the individual feel unseen and invalidated. So again, you can pause here and think about this question, but write down what you would do as a professional in that situation. And so, like I said, this is one case example that could be used, and it can be tailored to the population that you're working with. It can be tailored to think about, again, other questions, other reflection questions that students can do. And this can be an opening reflection question, an opening activity that you could do with your students, or it could be something that is intermixed into the discussion, the lecture that you're having throughout the class. I will mix and match sometimes. So sometimes I'll start off with something like the second question that we did, or the second activity, and sometimes I'll start off with a case example, and vice versa, like throwing things in there throughout the um the class to be able to think about these things. Basically a knowledge check. How are you intaking? Think about how you're intaking this material that we're talking about right now. And so we know that LGBTQIA plus individuals are disproportionately impacted by trauma. So things from bullying, family rejection, discriminatory policies, things like that. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about trauma-informed reflection, which means not only being aware of those experiences, but also reflecting on how our own reactions can affect the client that we're working with. So, for example, if a client's story may trigger some discomfort or defensiveness, that self-reflection can help us to pause, to sort of regulate and avoid re-traumatizing them. And this is where that reflection on action may come into play. that I talked about a little bit. And so this also may mean reflecting on any sort of vicarious trauma or burnout that may show up so that we can show up for our clients and be fully present for them. And one thing that can come out of this might be something like an activity that might come out of this might be something like asking yourself, what have I felt, or not what, when have I felt excluded or misunderstood? How does that inform the way that I practice as a social worker? How does that inform the way that I interact? And maybe it's particular with LGBTQI plus individuals or generally with diverse populations or people that are different than me. Those are some additional questions that we can ask ourselves. And so now we get into some of the strategies that we can look at. So how can we apply self-reflection in the classroom? First, the thing that I want to throw out there is that the classroom is a space to allow students to make mistakes, express any sort of discomfort, resistance, skepticism. This is that space to be able to do that. And I'll talk a little bit about addressing resistance in it's a slide or two. But one thing that we should think about is openly discussing or modeling our own self-reflection practices with our students. And so this can be by discussing times when you as the professor, as the educator, as the clinician felt vulnerable and the action steps that you took to reconcile those feelings. This can also look like being able to discuss things like power and privilege and how you have recognized them for yourself. We also build an affirming classroom a welcoming environment, affirming environment by not shying away from having the conversations. Or if we're not able to have the conversation, so there are some places that we're not able to talk about DEI or have conversations on LGBTQI plus individuals or other marginalized populations. So in that instance, we may speak to why it can't be discussed in the traditional ways that we would typically outwardly discuss something. And that can spark conversations. That can spark some reflection on, oh, why? I wonder why that is. Why is this continuing? And what are my thought processes around this and what comes up around this? We can also discuss the importance of supervision and consultation, and not just with a professional, but also with our peers and with their peers. And so providing a space in class for students to receive feedback from their peers, discuss how that feedback can be incorporated, and being able to talk about, okay, think about what was said. Why do you think that was said? Why was that feedback given to you? For example, I used to teach a CBT class, a CBT practice class. And so one of the activities and assignments that they had was to do a role play in front of the class. Each student would take a role, and take a concept from CBT and think about it and role play that with another student. And something that I would do at the end would ask their peers, the peers that were watching, to provide some level of feedback. And then as part of the assignment, as part of the written assignment, they would write a little bit about that feedback that they were given and talking about what they could take on from that, but also what that looked like for their own reflection. What did they reflect on as they heard that feedback, but also as they reflected back on how they did and how they think they did in that role play. And so that can help to really, again, incorporate some of that self-reflection into the classroom. We can help our students develop self-reflection specific skills. So things around using certain things. So like journaling and journaling prompts. So these prompts can include questions like, what were your first experiences of gender, sexuality, race, etc.? What parts of my identity am I most and least aware of on a daily basis, and why? What parts of my identity provide me with the most and least privileges, and why? What else? How was I socialized to think about certain aspects, certain identities? This can be really helpful. This can also include process recordings to think about what happened in the situation with a client. I think process recordings are so important and really emphasize the importance of self-reflection. Some things that also came up in my capstone interviews. One person talked about downtime and quiet time, and talking with them, talking with our students, talking with ourselves about what that looks like. And this would be a way to disconnect and allow the mind to go into some space where different connections can be made. And sometimes we want to keep that conversation going. So, but and here's the thing, like, sometimes we want to keep that conversation going in the sense that we don't want that. We don't want any downtime. We don't want any of that quiet time because it feels uncomfortable. And we may not let the room breathe. But we want to have some silence. And we want to teach our students how to allow for silence, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. And so, as I said, this is where different connections can be made when it comes to things that have happened or what needs to be reflected on in that moment. And then there's also things around like body work and mindfulness. So things like yoga, body awareness, body scans, meditation, anything like that. That can be really helpful. And so as I said, I start each of my classes with a reflection activity. It could be a video, it could be a body scan, it could be any of these questions, these activities here. But I want to give students the time to just sit with those questions and just think about what those things are that come up for them in particular. And that has been so helpful in the ways that they're then interacting with the material as we're talking about things throughout the course, throughout the synchronous session. It really brings about a level of, okay, that makes sense. And now I need to think about this just a little bit more. And so I talked a little bit about having that structure for self-reflection. And so here are some examples or some suggestions of how we can assess self-reflection in the classroom, in students, but also with ourselves. So if we want students to grow in self-reflection, we need to think about how we measure it. And so things like reflective journals, guided with prompts can really show how awareness deepens over time. And so this could be a prompt that you use throughout the course. It could be a prompt that, okay, the first day, this is what I'm looking at. by last class of the semester, I'm also looking at these same questions to see what has changed, what has stayed the same, what do I continue to need to pay attention to. And so any of the final assignment, especially in my diversity class, we add in some of those things. What have you learned? Compare that to what's happening in the beginning of the semester, or what your thought processes were in the beginning of the semester. And how does that come out? We can also use things around like self-reflection or self-assessment rubrics, and that can help students identify any strengths and areas of growth that they may need. So something that I have created is for lack of a better word, self-reflection inventory that can be provided to students. I will say I just created it probably about a couple months ago, so I have not implemented anything like this. But I would be really interested to see what that would be like for my students. We can also provide feedback on case studies, the responses, feedback on the discussions that they're doing, the assignments. So just about every assignment that I have created for, again, I'm thinking about my diversity class. For every assignment that I've created for the diversity class, there's an element of reflection in it. And every time I grade their assignments, I comment on the reflection that they've had to reiterate the importance of how that reflection comes about. And ensuring that, and it also helps to ensure that those connections, that reflection connects to practice in some way. And this is not to grade someone's vulnerability, but to encourage students to be consistent and have meaningful reflection. And that becomes a habit and not just an assignment. And so that can be really, really helpful when thinking. And something that I also mentioned earlier was that resistance and navigating resistance and restrictive environments. So as we know, across the country, we're seeing more anti-DEI, the executive orders, legislation, things like that have limited how some educators can talk about race, gender identity, sexuality, things like that. So as social workers, this creates tension between the restrictions and our ethical obligations to build cultural humility, cultural competence within our students. And so one way to navigate is to ground our work in more universal values that pretty much no one can argue against. So things like dignity, respect, and trauma-informed care, client well-being. People can argue against those things, but these are things that we can throw out there and have some basis behind, for lack of a better word. And these are all things that are aligned with the code of ethics. And even if certain terms are restrictive, we can still foster reflection on things around bias, privilege, client-centered care. We may not be able to use those words in particular, but we can find those ways to be creative. And I'll talk a little about creativity in a little bit. And so self-reflection becomes so crucial in these, especially in these restrictive environments, because it helps us to recognize that when fear or discomfort are around, it may lead us to self-censor in ways that compromise our values. And we also need to find those creative entry points. So things like using case studies, wellness frameworks, empathy building exercises to be able to introduce concepts like equity, inclusion, equality, anything like that. And the thing that we have to also think about is that even in restrictive environments, advocacy does not disappear. It just may look different. And so we may partner with a professional organization, working collaboratively, providing peer support are all ways we can continue to stand with our LGBTQIA plus clients and any sort of principles that may be present in that, even in those restrictive environments. And so we also can present, when we're looking at this, we can present neutral, practice-based scenarios that require students to reflect on their reactions, reflect on their decision-making, focusing on critical thinking, ethical decision-making. We can frame these reflections as critical thinking, which is a skill that we need as social workers. And thinking about perspective taking or even some of that cognitive flexibility to replace some words if we need to. And that is sort of where some of that creativity will come into play. And as I said, thinking about emphasizing ethics, using the code of ethics as a foundation for discussing self-awareness, cultural humility, professional growth. And we may also have to frame discussions around specific ethical dilemmas rather than specifically on diversity, equity, inclusion terminology. Again, this is like if you are in that restrictive environment, you're not able to do that. And this is also where that creativity comes into play. And so we're educators, we're social workers, we're caseworkers. We've had to learn how to be creative and how to creatively advocate for services that are needed and getting services covered that need to be. And so this is the time for us to continue to utilize that creativity as much as we can. And so when we think about going back to that advocacy piece, self-reflection is not just about the micro level. It also has macro implications. And so on a policy level, we can advocate for inclusive organizational practices like gender neutral bathrooms, accurate pronoun usage in documentation, having documentation that reflects many different aspects of a person's experience. We can also work collectively to challenge any sort of harmful legislation that targets our LGBTQI plus clients in different areas. We can support inclusive curricula and training that make students feel safe, feel seen, being able to talk through some of these things. And so reflection helps us notice where we may stay a little bit more silent, out of comfort. And it also challenges us to use our voices to advocate on so many different levels, the community level, policy level, anything like that. And advocacy is reflection in action. And so to sum this all up, self-reflection can help to enhance the readiness and competency that we have for ourselves, but also with our students in working with our LGBTQI plus clients. Self-reflection is also the ethical responsibility of social workers. And also integrating this self-reflection into curricula can help provide better outcomes for our clients. And so before we wrap up, I want you to engage in a moment of reflection, just to end this all together. So think about this question. So there'll be a couple options. So this first option, think about this question. What challenges do you face when practicing self-care or self-reflection, I should say? So think about that. And another option to reflect on. How do your identities shape your interactions with clients? These small practices mirror what we ask clients to do. Pause, reflect, be present. And so reflection is always more powerful when it's shared in community. So I would love to hear and see what that looks like for you all. I also provided a list of some resources. This is absolutely not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to provide some resources for additional material to read up on and to even give to your clients, give to your students, anything like that. And that is it. So I thank you all for coming to and listening to this presentation. I also added some references here on the things that I use. But yeah, please reach out with any questions. And yeah, I hope you have a good rest of your day.